Foundation. Upheaval. The human soul was not created by accident. Just as every building that stands and every tool is designed, a soul was the offspring of creativity and hubris. A mysterious being known only as the One created the world in the small pocket of the universe in which it resides today. No reason was shared and no answer was hidden as to why the One created this place, nor is there enlightenment as to where this divine being came from or how it came to be. All that is true is that the One created the soul in its own visage. The soul didn't come first, however. The idea was brought forth in the infancy of this realm, but the stage had to be set before anything else. With an inexperienced hand, the One spawned life in many simple forms. Plants, the sun, a gust of wind, and animals alike. Flourishing with color and bliss, a vision slowly settled into place. Limitations were removed as intrigue and its own power grew. Soon vast mountain ranges erupted from the earth and deep pockets of water were trenched across the globe, each with new life to occupy the space. Soon the being witnessed how these biomes steadily expanded out of its own control. A winter's chill and summer's blaze cycled over time, affecting all current life that it had made. Over millions of years, the One experimented with different forms of life in different climates to occupy land, sea, and air, obsessed with the new struggle that became readily apparent with every addition and subtraction. Balance. The more that was created, the more the world required its constant maintenance. Otherwise, it would collapse as inevitably the harsh conditions would grow and overpower serenity, causing the One to wipe the slate clean over and over. The world was tested. Sometimes, though, the world fell into chaos. Volcanoes and hurricanes ravaged the planet, making it impossible for existing life to perpetuate without interference. Other times, the oceans remained docile, and nary a harsh wind would topple a tree. This resulted in stagnation, where the world grew quiet and organic progression stopped. The One came to understand that in order for this world to exist without its touch, it needed to introduce a variable that could keep balance all on its own. After much contemplation and many more trials, the world was wiped one more time. Taking many inspirations from existing animals, it designed a deeply complex being, self-sufficient with many stages in its life for growth and adaptation under many various conditions. But then, just before spawning the species on its soil, a final consideration took place. The One had an epiphany, a revelation that led to the creation of a divine substance emulating that of its own construct. Emotions, virtues, rational thinking, morality. So many shards of what this being represented were carefully mimicked and crafted into a small but very powerful energy. A soul. Each new biped that was granted a soul started to exhibit behaviors never before seen. Intelligent interaction which evolved into language, communication which resulted in community, which itself introduced structure. So many traits never before seen started developing over thousands of years as these inhabitants evolved into what the One now called humans. A peculiar thing then happened. The souls resonating within these humans had a mysterious influence on other living creatures. Those that displayed more positivity passed along similar emotions to animals and other humans, while negativity begot negativity just the same. After all this time, their intuitive minds had deduced something magical about themselves, something they all had in common. A whisper in the wind introduced the word, and it spread like wildfire. The idea of a soul became commonplace amongst the species and was often cited as the cause to many of their interactions. Concepts like love, hate, willpower, depression, and many, many more were all attributed to an individual's soul. At first, the One believed that knowledge would bring them closer together. Instead, it diversified them into clusters. Many new beliefs were formed, and the humans found ways to segregate themselves from one another, a new variable. Even though the makeup of every soul started the same, each one drastically changed over the course of human lifespan. Even the offspring were brought into this world with a soul of their very own. The One watched while humanity expanded across the globe with their very presence altering everything they came across. Destroying and building, fighting and loving, such altercations led to inevitable death, and with this came the liberation of tattered souls. Each and every soul that returned to the One had to be reformed and distributed again. A laborious task that led to another idea. With little effort, a new cycle was set in place. When a soul leaves the body, it was destined to distribute its energy into the world itself, providing enough energy to fuel that which was maintained by the One. Plant life, water, air, anything and everything that required the touch of the Maker was sustained by the deceased. As for the conscience of those to pass, they too were set to automatically redistribute among a new generation. A perfect, non-intrusive cycle that allowed the One to closely monitor the balance without having to lift a finger. For a while, everything was working out as intended. Humans surpassed every previous generation in technology, science, and culture, far exceeding expectations. The population exploded as life expectancy increased, but soon, new issues arose. Problems such as food shortage, pollution, and loss of faith. The ultimate downfall of their lives was uncertainty. While many aligned themselves with different religions, worshipping false idols and old gods, a vast number remained either willfully ignorant or chose a darker allegiance. Inversely, many chose the path of light, becoming harbingers of purity and goodwill to the masses, countering those that derived pleasure from violence and war. Nevertheless, within every soul was a troubled existence. Not a single human had an answer as to how they came to be or why they existed in the first place. A lack of purpose crumbled countless minds as the One noticed many changes in its precious children. Still, it did not interfere, because the balance had remained throughout all this time. With that, the One had decided to rest, momentarily drifting away from its incubator and leaving the humans to live without its judging eye. A heavy sleep befell the One as life persisted in the background. Each cycle around the benevolent sun, humanity grew further and further from the desired equilibrium. Imperfections in the reproduction of the species caused future generations to grow intolerant. Time between great conflicts shortened. A belief in a higher power was either used to oppress or snuffed entirely. Those that stood for good and righteousness dwindled, and corruption was spreading like wildfire. In the darkest part of history, even the souls that once represented purity and divinity had soured, mutating into fierce demons that manipulated those teetering on the line to the side of hatred. With that horrid infection came a new understanding of worldly energies. With nothing but time and a desire for chaos, the demons crawled the surface in search of what bled life, feeling that resonant power within themselves and others that mirrored them, hidden in plain sight. They hunted. Soon, those that grew powerful enough in their own right discovered those precious pockets of energy where the souls siphoned through, and then the perversion of life began. Every deceased soul destined to be recycled was stolen and raped, absorbed by the unnatural spawn and used to further mutate. Overflowing with magic they didn't understand, this rising faction unintentionally ripped a hole in the air, opening a doorway to a foreign dimension. Undenounced to the One, every time a draft of the world was smothered and restarted, that process of annihilation caused a ripple to surge through the perceivable universe. That ripple carried with it a ghostly fragment of the previous world in the form of an overlapping dimension that existed just outside of this one, and imperceptible to all. A reality dubbed as Underworld was adopted, and the reign of evil dawned on mankind while their maker slept. Underworld was a realm lost and forgotten in a time just before the souls came to be, an earth entirely devoid of the sun, instead kept alight by a molten landscape and core that spewed massive amounts of radiation. Any life that could be sustained was horribly violent and inane. This adopted dimension fueled the horrid energies that circulated within and further manipulated their already contorted minds. Hungry, ravenous, this malice shifted the spirits of many predisposed to negativity. A wave of decadence consumed weak and broken spirits, and the world plunged deeper into madness. Those who forfeited their morality and adapted to a life of misery and hate were engulfed by that same writhing invasive vigor. With every new dead soul came new energy to feast on and share amongst the vindictive. Fight as they may, the powers of good were no match for the overwhelming darkness. Evil had persuasion, a tendency to imprint harmful ideas and negligence with tainted fingers, deploying spiritual poison throughout the souls of those lingering, walking the tightrope of sanity. This overgrowth of negative energy and the stealing of Earth's precious pockets of souls caused the planet itself to decay. Natural resources dried out and all life was pushed to its limits. A shred of humanity was all that remained, unsalvageable but so very familiar to those who opposed the dreadful incarnations. This restraint did not last, and soon hostility was the only means for survival. The demons found power in the trembling, fickle hearts of man, exploiting their fear and malcontent to get a foothold on the forces of light. Now only violence would counter violence. With the majority of the population tainted and mangled, the last beacon of hope slowly started to fade. With that will submitted, the forces of evil coagulated into a single form, a volatile disease of swarming mist that vastly expanded, lashing out raging tendrils of smoke and crackling static that decimated and absorbed all that opposed it. Putrescent manipulation devoured every living thing it came across as it made a journey across the globe. At last, the One awoke to a thunderous roar of agony. The collective screams of its precious children finally reached the great being, and it rose in horror. From where it sat, the exact reasons behind this catastrophe could not be analyzed. All it knew was that this reality was crumbling. Furious and impatient, the One cast a heavy wave of cleansing magic to sterilize the planet so it may determine what had caused such a collapse. However, the spell had no effect. Instead, a deafening howl accompanied by a vision of tainted mist was broadcast to the Creator's mind. The spawn of evil had grown so powerful that the One could not wipe it clean. Watching as the world was consumed, the One weighed the few options it had. Ultimately, only one resolution could near guarantee the souls would be saved. It descended with heavenly light to meet the giant cloud, taking on the shape of humanity, though devoid of features. The One boasted a beautiful slate of piercing white essence as its body, and set foot on the crumbling soil before the beast. The amalgamation retained a size comparable to a mountain, its presence accompanied by the thunder and raging winds. The moment the two occupied the planet, many more tears in reality split open like lesions to another time, a different world. Witnessing such a reaction, the One lowered its head in shame. It understood this creature was a mistake, a consequence of its own hubris that it must now take responsibility for, otherwise the perfection of the soul would be unattainable. A flare of holy light glistened across the land as the One began its repentance. The darkness that loomed, for a brief moment, exhibited fear. A massive shockwave spread across the earth, which struck every ounce of remaining life to the ground. For the first time in over 100 years, the world was silent. Acting on instinct, the darkness closed in to devour the transient being, only to be met by a simple gesture. The One rose its translucent hand in the air, of request. Halted by this motion, it idled in a confused state. An immense static built up between them, and the climate responded accordingly. Their power pulled together, a new storm was constructed above. Dark clouds quickly formed and ripped at the Earth's surface with an unforgiving blitz of lightning strikes. These cracks of natural fury severed the skin of the Earth, causing the ground to split apart and fill with the heavy rainstorm. Tornadoes skipped over the crevice, picking up wildfires and throwing the flames for miles around. At the center of the apocalyptic scenario caused by this manifested energy, the two maintained a short distance. A small gap, easily closed, protected by a dome formed from their clashing power. The darkness twitched and fluctuated rapidly. Its pulsing, smoky mass held its ground without sign of weakness, while the hope of humanity stood lax yet proud. Its collective conscience evaluated its opposition, keeping that single hand raised. Then, with a flick of its wrist, the storm ceased, and all the surrounding air was thrown outward, reformed as a smooth, gentle wind that rushed over the surface of the planet. The dead and corrupted forest turned to dust, and the lifeless oceans evaporated into thin air. All else living was broken down and fueled this purging wave. The dense fog of malicious imbalance was further shaken by this display of reconciliation. Provoked and wrought with desire, it too took shape. A show of respect and intrigue, condensing its all-encompassing form of tightly packed darkness into a figure mirroring its opposition. They stood together, face to face. Polarized opposites of clashing nature remained motionless in a silent measurement of will. The darkness felt disturbed, and its shape reflected that unease. Unlike the calm, solid demeanor of the One, the darkness lashed out in place. Multiple versions of its own shape displayed many hollow images of agony and contained force which flailed and thrashed sadistically in place. Dark, misty tentacles whipped in random directions, getting tangled in themselves, while the intent to devour all was prominent in the mind of this hateful shadow. It understood that its strength had been matched. This assumption was nearly true, however. The One knew all too well that the evil had an advantage, a speck, just a minuscule more power than itself. Enough not to risk the fate of all it loved in a heroic battle. Just as the One feared the power it had created, the darkness too felt overwhelmed by this beacon of light. And so, a compromise was shared in silence. The two extended their fickle trust and held hands. A mute agreement was stated, and with that joining, the two split vertically in half. 4 figures now stood parallel. 2 halves of one whole being of light were side by side, mirrored by the 2 halves of one whole being of darkness. Each half then joined with its glaring opposite, thus merging as 2 separate figures once again. Each split down the middle, sharing equal parts pure and evil. With the antithesis coming together, all remaining outbursts of chaos had been soothed, and the vacant earth had its moment to rest. One of these 2 sprouted feathered wings and promptly rose to the sky. The other craned its neck and watched the distance grow between them. The being to remain on Earth was compacted entirely into a violet-gray ball made of swirling energy particles. The first new wind of the world carried these particles on a journey around the globe, bringing life back from desolation. Once all was restored, the remaining concomitant power distributed itself among millions of people and countless other forms of life on Earth. The being that rose above the Earth used the knowledge of these tears to create a unique rift, locating a ghost of the very first world it had created. A small pocket of infinitely looping space with no end or beginning that shined bright with the scale version of the world's sun at the center. Marble slabs and ivory structures remained from the days of material experimentation and were adapted as a new home to observe from. This place was called Nexus.